Hello and welcome to NewsClick. Trump has withdrawn from Paris Climate Agreement, and to discuss the issue we have with us the Raghunandan from Delhi Science Forum, who is also expert on climate policies. Welcome to NewsClick, Raghu. So Trump has withdrawn from the Paris Climate Agreement as he had said in his election campaigns. What are its implications on the climate change and the climate policy overall?
The first thing, of course, is that while Trump's withdrawal of the US is shocking, it's not surprising at all. Despite the fact that there were several divisions within the administration, several people who were advocating that the US not withdraw but do something short of that, he's decided to withdraw. And this is, I think, quite typically Trump. And he wants to show that he doesn't care for anybody else's opinion. And that is the biggest implication of the United States withdrawal from Paris. The US is the world's second largest emitter, and if you take historical emissions into account, it's responsible for close to half of all the accumulated carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Clearly, therefore, the United States is one of the parties majorly responsible for climate change as we see it today. So what he's essentially doing now is thumbing his nose at the entire world and said, whatever be the consequences of past US actions and now the US withdrawing from climate change, you go ahead and face it, I don't care. The implications of this are that the US commitment itself under the Paris Agreement was not particularly great. They had committed to reducing their emissions by 26 to 28% compared to 2005 levels by 2025. And that really amounts to just a 7 to 9% reduction based on a 1990 baseline, which is what most other developed countries have committed to. And this compares with an EU commitment to reduce their emissions by 40% to a 1990 baseline. So in the first place, the US commitment was not that big. Yet, the fact that it is a substantial chunk of the total global emissions going forward means that already the total Paris agreements, commitments by different countries was not equivalent to restricting temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius. The US withdrawal is now going to make this problem worse. So we can clearly see that the world is going to struggle. It was earlier anticipated that temperature rise could be as much as between 3 to 3.5 Celsius, which you could now see going up even further. Countries like India, who are among the top 10 worst affected regions, will suffer greater impacts. And I am particularly anxious about the island states, the small island developing countries, who actually run the risk of complete submergence under rising sea levels.
But what will be its implications if you look at domestic level?
Probably Donald Trump's main domestic base, which supported him in the elections, which is even now, despite all the fumbles and grumbles around Donald Trump's moves, still continued to back Donald Trump. He still has a base level support among the constituency which had supported him during the elections. They are not likely to be fazed by this now. But in terms of the general population, most opinion polls in the US show a roughly 60% support for more active US involvement in climate control. Already more than 400 cities, states and counties in the United States have legislated pledges of cutting emissions equivalent to the US submissions in Paris, and in some cases even higher. There is already a groundswell where several of these states, governors, mayors are joining together to reiterate those pledges, and one can see that momentum catching up further now, and Trump's base assumptions of creating more jobs through greater investments in fossil fuels and coal, we are already seeing not yielding the results that he is expected. But this will take time to show. But one can expect a further polarization of American opinion on the issue of climate, which will tend to be more favorable to greater climate action than Trump has anticipated.
So on one hand, he's withdrawn from the agreement, and on the other hand, he's talking about renegotiations. What does this renegotiation mean, and what are its implications?
There is no renegotiation possible, and yesterday's spokespersons for the UNFCCC, as well as leading European figures, have said we cannot renegotiate a treaty which has been agreed upon by 195 countries because one country wants it to be renegotiated. In practical terms also, what would renegotiation mean? A more lenient terms for the United States, or more stringent terms for 195 countries? Clearly the latter will not be accepted by anybody, and I think Trump is really not being serious if he expects to go into a renegotiation and everybody agreeing to even more lenient terms for the US than they have already achieved. In fact, if you ask me, many commentators, particularly on the left, have long criticized the entire process of global negotiations over the last decade or so as bending over backwards in order to please the United States and as a way of attracting the US to come back into the climate treaty. We have long been predicting that these efforts will come to no good, and that in any case the US pledges will be very thin. They're not worth the effort that you're doing. The amount of dilution that the earlier Kyoto Protocol has gone through to reach where the Paris summit has reached now has really not been worth the effort of getting the US in, particularly knowing this quite predictable outcome with Trump's election. We should also keep in mind that for long there has been a bipartisan consensus in the US Congress in particular, cutting across both Democrats and Republicans, which has not allowed the executive branch to move forward. And in fact, even the pledge that President Obama made at Paris was made despite a lack of support in Congress, not because of any support that he got from grassroots.
So while announcing the withdrawal from agreement, Trump specifically pointed out India and China, and with the way India has been moving with strategic partnership with the United States, what implications is it going to have on our relations with the United States, different joint partnerships that we are taking and different policies that we are pursuing?
Firstly, President Trump made several sweeping comments. One of these was that India has made receipt of what Trump called billions and billions and billions of dollars from the US and other developed countries, conditional, and that our commitments to Paris would be conditional on receiving all this money. There is no such conditionality in India's pledge at the INDC, although our INDCs could have been a little more clear about which part of its pledges were to be domestically funded and which would require or call for some international funding. There's only one part of our commitment where India has said that we would be able to achieve that if we receive international funding and technology, and that is a pledge to increase installed renewable energy capacity to 40% of our total installed capacity by 2030, provided we get international assistance. The second issue, which I think Donald Trump is unaware of, is that India is not a big recipient of US aid. Today, India receives only $3 billion globally from all sources in aid, and in developmental aid, US contribution to India is only $100 million, and this also from next year is slated to come down to $34 million. So there's no billions and billions and billions at work here. There are only a few dollars which, as far as I'm concerned, the United States can keep. You're right that a large part of India's position with regard to climate negotiations has hinged around an evolving strategic partnership with the United States and a desire to cement that partnership, in which India's position on climate was seen to be one important parameter, that India would make concessions on this in order to attract the strategic partnership by the United States. The left in India has long been critical of this position and has long argued that India should have been motivated more by domestic concerns, the impacts of climate on it, and by a need for alliance with our natural allies in the developing countries, the G77 and others, in order to underpin our climate policy. Nevertheless, the problem today that I think India faces is that in geopolitical terms, India has, over the past decade or more, boxed itself into a corner. We have forged a supposed strategic partnership with the United States, but in that process, we have diluted our relations with the developing countries, we have diluted our relationship with the European Union, and we have also diluted our relationships with former key allies like Russia, for example, who today is very ambivalent about its relations with India. India has also allowed itself to be sucked into a anti-China position of the United States, and certainly from a Chinese point of view, appearing as if India is joining the bandwagon to encircle China. We have not endeared ourselves to the Chinese in the past several months, including our stand on the OBOR programs and projects. So today, in geopolitical terms, India only has a tentative strategic alliance with the US, which it has achieved at the cost of all these other relationships. But this strategic relationship with the United States under Donald Trump's administration doesn't seem to exist anymore, because we all know that the Trump administration is not a long-term strategic thinker, but is a transactional presidency. So when next month Prime Minister Modi goes to the United States, what is he going to discuss with the US?
Thanks a lot, Raghu, for giving us your time, and as this proceeds, we'll be coming back to you on such issues. Thanks a lot. Thank you for watching NewsClick.